One of the things that I said to Dave was, I said, I think there's a difference. There's a way to talk about this stuff that is academic and intellectual, and then there's also a way to talk about it that is a political reality. And I think that social change movements get caught in the in-between. And then that tension between those two things drives them apart. And what I will tell people, and I know it does not necessarily make me popular, is that political change at the legislative level is never going to be radical. There is nothing radical about it. It is incremental. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, and it doesn't mean there aren't huge advantages to it, because we educate people, we engage people. I get to come do things like this. But that is not radical. And I said, you give me the opportunity for the revolution, I will be the first one there. But until people can even show up for a legislative day, I mean, I need to see the commitment from the community and from the people to say that if you can't even show up at the Capitol or make a call to your legislator, I have no faith that you're going to be next to me under some sort of more fundamental revolution. I mean, and so what I said is that, you know, there are different ways to talk about it. And so honestly, I could go into an academic mode, which would say that, yes, I do believe that there is an aspect of the justice system that is about, I could make a Marxist argument, which I actually do believe, which it is about, you know, it's a way to manage the underclass and the unemployment, and that as unemployment goes up, you're likely to see increases in prison populations. But I will also say that I think that that is not the approach that's effective or useful on a political level. And so the reality is how do you want to engage us, or what is your motivation? It doesn't mean you can't do both simultaneously, but this tension has to be addressed in some way.
Well, and one of the things that we've been thinking a lot, or talking a lot about at this kind of movement building platform is where, you know, if we think about this as ecology, so there's going to need to be a number of different organizations that are pushing on a number of fronts. And one of the things that we wanted to, you know, one of the things that I've been really impressed over the years watching some of the real successes that you guys have been able to make on the kind of reform at the legislative level with the incremental reforms is to raise both the visibility of the issues, both on racial disparities, but also actually on bills that matter for people, both, as you mentioned, jobs, for housing, for healthcare access, for length of stays for people. But so I guess where do you see, at least in Minnesota, do we have kind of a full ecology of radical thought that's actually helping to push some of the reform efforts? Because actually that would help. This was my argument. That would help and support your efforts if there was kind of a polarizing force on the other side that said actually, yeah, something a little bit more, I don't know, we'll just leave it there.
Well, the first thing I'd say is, I still think my thought is radical. No, I mean, I'm not willing to disavow myself from saying that I have radical thoughts. I mean, or believe in radical change or the need for it. Right. But, I mean, I would say one thing is that when you go to the extremes on either end, whether it be the traditional soft on crime, hard on crime, well, you don't get anywhere because no one's willing to come to the middle. So, you know, we have groups like the Catholic Conference who some of our partner organizations totally have different opinions about on numerous things, from gay marriage to abortion. We have some, you know, so we have numerous areas in which faith-based funding is another area which, you know, could be controversial, but that isn't what we're addressing. We're focused on one issue. But the side benefit of that is that because of those relationships, I can tell you in our own issue areas outside of this issue, it's helped us because there's a trust that's been built between opposing ideologies, and so they're more open to hearing from it. So I think that this issue work is actually the future of, you know, if people keep on talking about getting out of this partisan gridlock, I think the only future we have at this moment to address it is to start working on these issues. And I mean, there are groups that I thought I would never want to work with or have anything to do with. But I can tell you this is that one, it's improved my knowledge on the issue. It's forced me to tighten my arguments, but it's also broadened my view of my way of thinking about it. So again, I think I said earlier, this is a front end issue and a back end issue. And if I had a graph, what I normally like to do is use a dumbbell, because I always say that the front end is sort of the police and the prosecutors, and then the middle, the sort of line in between is basically the court system. It's the judges, you know, the prisons, and then it's the back. What happens on the back? You know, probation, parole, stuff like housing and employment, the impact on children. And the problem is that we're putting this huge weight on the middle part. And dumbbell's going to break, basically. Our court system today, Mark and I were at the Capitol, and they're underfunded. They have unbelievable caseloads. And I'll get specifically to racial disparities, but I just think it's important to, again, mention that corrections, people often use the term prison industrial complex, which is actually my least favorite term, because the correction system has absolutely no control over who comes into it. None. Those are decisions made by legislators, prosecutors, and on the front end of the system. The correction system takes who we have, and then based on the laws we have in place, puts people out. And so I just think that is not the best place to focus our energies. I think, again, it's on these front end issues and the back end issues. I will say that law enforcement, there's issues of, you could talk about racial profiling, and how people get into the system initially, and clearly these are compounded by issues of poverty and access to opportunity, and I think that's why we see racial disparities. But I also think the problem is then the impact of a criminal record carries much more weight than it used to, and part of it's the availability of criminal records. And so now employers who didn't used to, I think the last report I read said something, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, like 35% of employers 10 years ago checked criminal backgrounds, and now it's over 85%. And part of it is because it's so easy. In the old days, you literally used to have to walk down to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and you'd have to do a search by county and name to do it. So this was a big lack of motivation for employers, and same with housing. And so I think you have to address those policy issues on the front end and the back end, because if you can't get employment, if you haven't had good education, it impacts not just that individual, it impacts their families and their community. The other place, there are clearly overlaps with the education system. A recent article by Bruce Western and Becky Pettit demonstrated that in 1980, 10% of African American young men who didn't graduate from college or didn't graduate from high school ended up in the prison system. And today it's about 40%. So we know early on that this is an issue, but yet we're also not addressing the racial inequalities. And what I would say is it costs $35,000 a year to incarcerate one adult male, and it costs about $75,000 a year to incarcerate one juvenile. And clearly, buckets of money don't just flow from one place to another. But what I say is we have to stop saying that the criminal justice system is a place of last resort. And until we say that this is no longer an acceptable alternative, it won't force us to address some of these other issues. Well, I'll just talk about some of the solutions that we're working on and have worked on in the past. And I think one, of course, is something called Ban the Box. And in 2009, legislation was passed that required all public employers, so anyone, state, local government, to take the question off the application about criminal record. 10 years ago, if you were going to apply for a job, it used to say, have you been convicted of a felony in the last 7 years? Today, it says, have you ever been arrested or convicted? And so what this law did was say that, and what we know is because a lot of applications are online, it just automatically diverts your application into the trash can. So what this Ban the Box law did in 2009 was say that if you are a public employer, you are no longer allowed to ask the question until you're going to be granted an interview. And what it does is allow people to at least present themselves to them. And I think probably we have this experience all the time. We make assumptions about people, but once you meet them, you change your mind. And that's actually the advice that people who work on employment for ex-offenders is always given. Try to get in front of them so you can show them that you are someone different. So this year, one of the things, and this is why we need you to show up at the Day on the Hill and to call your legislators, is we're asking for an expansion of Ban the Box to all employers, so private sector employers included. And I think this is one thing because we know employment is one of the few things that we know impacts recidivism. So there's two things that criminologists and sociologists talk about. Basically, you age out of crime. The older you get, the less likely you are to commit crime. But the other thing is employment and support systems, so family and community. But the employment and family and housing, they're all interrelated. If you don't have a job, you can't get housing. If you don't have a job and you're homeless, you're not likely to be able to support your kids and be less likely to engage in your family. So these supports are all sort of like meshed into one. So we're going to ask for this, and we think one of the arguments we're making is that this is about jobs. if you've heard anything about on NPR, they're saying they're only going to address jobs issues. But this is about jobs. This is about giving people an opportunity to work. Wouldn't you rather have a tax-paying citizen than someone who is going to go back to prison at $35,000 a year? I think the other thing is we're proposing something called racial impact statement. And this is, oddly, Minnesota's the model for this from our Sentencing Guidelines Commission. And what a racial impact statement does, it's like an environmental impact statement or fiscal impact statement. So before any legislation is going to be introduced to a committee, it would require, that would change the offender population. So this could deal with probation, juvenile justice, sentencing. It would require on the front end the discussion about what would be the potential disparate impact. It doesn't mean that the legislator could still see that there's going to be disparate impact and vote in favor of it. And there might be times that that is warranted. But the reality is that we know how hard it is to have the racial conversation. So when it interjects that, it forces the conversation, or it makes it okay for the legislators to talk about it. But the other thing is the most poignant example is the crack cocaine disparities. That is something that we could have foreseen, and that has accounted for much of the prison expansion. And so hopefully the idea would be to mitigate or prevent some of those potential massive disparities that have helped increase the prison population. We're also looking at felony voting. Well, we also are going to try to introduce a bill on felony voting. This one will be more difficult in this session. And that's because almost between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 African American men on a given election is not eligible to vote because of a felony conviction. And what most people don't realize is that because we have such a small prison population, but yet a large probation population, the majority of people disenfranchised have never been to prison even. They are living in the community, they have kids, they're paying taxes, but yet they're not able to vote. And because we don't have a large prison population, we've just expanded the length, we just become more punitive, and we punish people for longer. And the result is someone could have for a first time offense, be on probation for 10 years and not be able to vote, never left the community, still be paying taxes. And even though there is this huge racial impact also, I think it's also important to note that there's also probably a class impact, because the majority of people that will still benefit is actually in greater Minnesota. And telling legislators this is actually really important, because as I mentioned, many of them are from greater Minnesota, and their fear is they're going to let people vote again and they're going to vote them out of office. To our dismay, maybe, it's not going to work that way. And in fact, when prisoners have been polled, they tend to be more conservative. They tend to believe in the death penalty and, if anything, skew towards the independent vote and conservative on social issues. So we should not be making assumptions also about the population that we're advocating for. I would say that there's certainly I think the idea of bringing ex-offenders to the Capitol to talk to their legislators is radical. And that's what we've been doing. So I totally agree with you, and I really appreciate that comment. In terms of the comparison between immigration, I think that you're right. It's very similar. And from my impression, one of the things that's been successful for people trying to battle the punitive approach to immigration has been talking about the fact that they are the backbone of our society and doing work. And this is one of the approaches we've taken with the coalition, is talking about this as people who want to work, who have the capacity to work, and are often doing jobs that no one else wants to do. But so I think that this idea, but I also think humanizing it and contradicting, we have to go a huge way because of the racial stereotyping about criminality. We actually go consciously out of our way, if we're doing it in a forum, to say we want a white person and a black person. We don't want just a black offender giving a testimonial. Because what message does that send? The underlying message is black people are the ones who are committing the crimes. When in fact we know that just isn't the truth, but that's what the media has sort of sent the message. So I think also humanizing the issue, so I agree. I just believe in actually creating spokespeople. I think there's tons of people who have criminal records who haven't felt comfortable talking about it. I think that they should start talking about it, because what people don't realize is your neighbor next door probably has a DUI, because we have one of the highest rates of DUIs. And that's probably impacting their life in a huge way. But I just think changing it from a conversation about individual also to community and family impact.